Hey everybody, today we are debating on the origin of species, and we are starting right now. Thanks for coming everybody, we are stoked to have you. This is going to be a lot of fun as we debate on the origin of species, and we have two gentlemen here tonight who are going to debate with their hearts and gusto in the debate to the highest extent. And the reason I say that is because you all know standing for truth. A lot of you, you're even like, just standing for truth, he drives me crazy. We understand that. That's okay. That's normal, friends. Basically, I'm teasing you standing for truth. We love you, buddy. We're glad you're here. And Snake was right. Snake was right. Also has energy. He's got gusto. He's excited to jump into it, and we appreciate that. He's got passion. So, likewise, just want to mention, you guys may remember or may not remember our good friend. He hasn't been on the show in quite a while, but we're just extremely enthusiastic and excited to have him, to say the least. Do you guys remember Samuel? So you guys should hopefully be able to see Samuel on the bottom right. He is our co-moderator for the night. Do you remember when Samuel debated Pelagia? Basically, that was in the fall. That was our second debate ever that we hosted, and it was rocking. It was off the charts. So just want to say, Samuel, how you doing, buddy? Welcome back to the channel.
Hi, James. Glad to be here as always, and certainly looking forward to this one. It can't get more exciting than creation and evolution.
Absolutely. So you'll notice with Samuel is that, man, I don't know if I've seen anybody smile more than Samuel. He's just filled with joy, and so I think you're gonna love him, people. If this is your first time meeting him, you definitely will love him. So, with that, just gonna mention a quick couple of house cleaning type things that we're pumped up about in the future. One is, you've probably heard by now, in case you haven't, you have to hear about the debate on God's existence, which is this Wednesday. 2 days from now, we're going live at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with Mike Jones, the man behind Inspiring Philosophy, as well as Tom Jump, who is over at the Non Sequitur show tonight. Tom is a formidable debater. He's the dark horse. Nobody knew a lot about him coming in. He was kind of like, who's this Tom Jump guy? And it was like, whoa, this Tom Jump guy can debate. This guy is well read, and he's got a great working memory. Namely, he can juggle a lot of information at once. He's a great debater. So that's going to be an epic showdown. As well as we just booked this one. We're very excited about it. This is Kent Hovind from Dr. Dino Creation Ministry has agreed to debate Dr. Cy Gart, the biochemist from BioLogos. That's going to be off the charts as they debate our science and religion at war. So we hope that you're able to make it to that. It's going to be a blast. And now let's introduce the debaters. So Standing for Truth has been here before. He is a provocateur. He's got energy, and want to let you know, everybody, the gentlemen's links are in the description right now for you to check them out. So like I said, even if you see Standing for Truth and you're just like, I can't take it, don't worry. He's going to grow on you. If you check out his link, you'll say, I kind of like him. And Snake was right. Also, we got to email, and he's a really friendly guy, and I love his passion, his gusto. I think you're going to enjoy him too. So please check out both of their links, because hey, worst case scenario, even if you don't agree, you at least heard them from them themselves. You didn't hear a summary of them or a straw man, even worse. You got to hear their case straight from them. So with that, we're just going to give Standing for Truth and Snake Was Right a chance to share about what they've been up to on their channel. So maybe in about 30 to 60 seconds, Standing for Truth, if you want to share what you've been up to at your channel. Thanks for coming on tonight, buddy.
Well, thanks so much, James. I appreciate your energy as well. I appreciate your zeal. Your channel's great. I can't stop recommending it. It's amazing. You're putting on some really good shows, some really good debates. Nothing too crazy going on my channel, just typical discussions, videos, some good discussions coming up as well. So if anyone's interested, click away, subscribe. That'd be awesome. But I'm really looking forward to this. Taylor and I have had a couple back and forth discussions already. So if anyone wants to check those out, especially if they feel that this debate here was engaging and exciting. I'd recommend that. But other than that, thanks Samuel, thanks James, and thanks Taylor.
You bet. Oh, it's our pleasure to have you. And it's also our pleasure to have Snake Was Right. Taylor, thanks for coming on tonight, buddy. What have you been up to at your channel?
Well, I made a few videos here a couple years ago, and then recently I just jumped right back in with some of this creationist stuff. So I'm interested in a lot of topics on debate. So hopefully I'll see you around discussing lots of different things.
Yeah, you bet. Well, you're always welcome. I've got to tell you, folks, Taylor was so passionate that I think I caught him he was debating already in the live chat with people before coming on here. I was like, Taylor, you could debate them later. But we're thankful to have a guy here who's got such passion and vigor. Is that he's getting into it with Nephilim free. Neff he has a way of drawing people. So we love your gusto. Snake was right. You got an enthusiasm for it. So we appreciate that. And we are going to kick off the moderating duties to Samuel now in terms of the timing and scheduling for this format. So he's going to just explain the format for you, and then he's going to get the debaters started, and then I'm going to try to catch up on questions that have already come in for the Q&A. So Samuel, passing it over to you. Thanks for being here, buddy.
Indeed, truly a pleasure, James, and thanks for allowing me to participate in this. I'm truly looking forward to this. The format today will involve a 12-minute opening from both sides, which will begin first with Standing for Truth, and then we'll have an opening statement from Taylor, Snake Was Right, and then we will from there proceed on to a 10-minute rebuttal period, followed with a 20-minute discussion. This will not be the typical cross-examination, but indeed there's a free discussion. I will jump in if and when necessary, but otherwise it'll be really good to hear both these gentlemen just discuss with each other on both the opening and the rebuttal period what was brought up. And finally, we'll have a 5-minute closing section, closing presentation from both sides, and then we'll be, of course, passing it back to James for the Q&A. I understand there will be between 20 to 30 minutes for that. So with no further delay, let's head on first to Standing for Truth. The time begins when you start with your opening statement.
Well, I'm just going to share my my screen and make sure that, because I think James has to make sure that's good to go.
Just hooked you up, buddy.
Awesome. So we can see the screen then?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, well, let's get this party started, guys. Origins debate, biblical creation versus evolution, fairy tales of the evolutionist, chemical evolution, for example. You know, that origin of the first living cell from simpler non-living chemicals. This type of chemical evolution has absolutely zero empirical scientific evidence for support, but we're going to be talking about the origin of species today, bacteria to biologist evolution, biological evolutionary theory, the origin of new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms. Now, GUDU evolution, Taylor here, he's going to have to explain to us how the four-dimensional genome with multiple overlapping codes and chock full of meta-information came about. There is no human information system that can even begin to compare to the multi-dimensional genome. The genome set of instructions is not a simple linear array of letters. It's a dynamic, self-regulating, and it's multidimensional, as I've explained. Now, pawns come to people evolution. It's pure imagination. The evolutionists, they hope, they dream, they imagine. It's science. It's empirical science to say that dogs produce dogs, but it's not science to say that dogs, pine trees, bacteria, and whales are related. Evolutionists imagine that mutations make something new and better. Evolutionists imagine that all these small-scale variations will eventually add up to make something we don't actually observe. Time is the hero for the evolutionists. Evolutionists imagine that time can solve all their problems. I say evolution's a religion because time is their god. If I told you that Superman could fly quickly through the air, you'd say that's silly. But if I told you Superman could fly slowly through the air, you'd say that's more believable, maybe even more scientific. If I told you that Mary Poppins could fly quickly through the air with her umbrella, you'd say that's a fairy tale. That's crazy. But if I told you Mary Poppins could fly slowly through the air with her umbrella, you'd say that's not a fairy tale. Superman flying through the air, Mary Poppins flying through the air, and a single-celled organism evolving into a whale are all fairy tales at the end of the day. Grandpa, like I said, evolutionists hope, they dream, they imagine. Now, for example, here's some of their fanciful imagination going on. In Discover magazine, was your ancestor a sea sponge? Now, evolutionists, they'll hide their science fiction-based religion under the disguise of empirical science. We know better than that, don't we? The evolutionists actually publish this type of nonsense. You'd think that they'd be somewhat embarrassed, at least, to publish something like this. Nope, they're actually proud. The evolutionists and SpongeBob themselves should go start a private school together where they can convince others that dogs and banana plants are related. Now, let's get to the biblical-based model, because it's just too close for comfort for evolutionists. And evolutionists won't even dispute this data, because if we only started with 2 people, all the people today should have a low genetic diversity based on the biblical record of Adam and Eve. And if we started with millions of people, opposite of what the Bible records, you're going to have a lot of genes floating around, a population of, say, 1 million strong. But if you only started with 2 people, Adam and Eve, that restricts the diversity today. If the Bible is correct, which I am arguing for, and Adam is our ancestor, there should only be 1 male ancestor of humanity. The mitochondrial DNA, it's a little piece of DNA inherited from our mothers, exclusively from our mothers. We can build a family tree of all the females in the world, and there should only be 1 female ancestor. If evolution is true, these don't have to be true. And we know that Eve was taken from Adam, and so most genes should come in 2 versions. And this is exactly what we find. This is exactly what we know to be true, and completely consistent with a biblical-based model. The Bible itself, as recorded in Genesis, predicted this thousands of years ago. Now, it's about defining terms when it comes to evolution, because creationists believe in change, and we would even agree that biological evolution means a change in allele frequency in populations over time, but it's about that type of change. Now, we would say that mutations themselves are destruction and not actually construction. And neo-Darwinism lacks incredible explanatory power in regards to the origin of phenotypic complexity, anatomical novelty, and the origin of non-gradual modes of transition, aka abrupt fossil appearance. Now, like I said, we predict change. Species are not static, and neither are their genomes. Species change over time, and sometimes in pre-planned, non-random pathways. This can even occur through pre-existing algorithms. Changes could occur through homologous crossover, even jumping genes, ALUs, for example, and of course by other mutation-related means. Now, we look to the created heterozygosity hypothesis because according to God's command to be fruitful and multiply, we wouldn't expect God to have wanted that to be carried out through cloning. That wouldn't make any sense. So we believe that, and we're hypothesizing that God created Adam and Eve and the original created kinds with pre-existing functional DNA differences. And if you have these heterozygous ancestors, an almost limitless variety of combinations of chromosomes, genes, and traits are possible. But it's not just by mutation, because in the biblical creation model, recombination and gene conversion would provide many new varieties of combination of traits quickly, since the differences, as I've said, are already built in. It's pre-existing genetic diversity. So visible distinctiveness based on this pre-existing functional DNA differences encoded at the start by God, offspring would be rapid. These design variants, though, they would be expected to be created within useful linkage groups, of course, and they would originate at high allelic frequencies. And the inbuilt alternatives God put into Adam and Eve, they're scrambled over time. Picture shuffling a deck of cards, and new traits might arise during this process. But most importantly, this hypothesis makes testable and falsifiable predictions. Evolutionists, they're somewhat confused because evolutionists have treated 2 very different phenomenon, adaptation to environments and evolution of higher life forms, as if they were the same thing. It doesn't take a genius to see that these are different issues. Adaptation can routinely be accomplished by loss of information. The development of higher life forms, on the other hand, always requires a large increase in net information. We predict, based on the design model, nested hierarchies and even mosaic creatures. because we look to the fact that we are made in God's image, and we can get a sense for what kinds of design patterns God might have used by studying and examining the patterns that result from human designs. As I've shown, genetics confirms the biblical creation. We look to the three major haplogroups that indicate after the flood, Noah's three daughters-in-law, which would have, if we look, it's three independent lines of evidence that fit exactly what we see in mitochondrial DNA. The history of humanity based on this phylogenetic tree is in our genome. What we know about mitochondrial DNA of human fits the 6,000-year timescale, explains the three haplogroups and the relative differences, DNA differences between pre and post-flood humanity. Now, junk DNA, functionality versus non-functionality, that's a prediction that creationists have always made, and that's a prediction based on the fact that we only understand less than 5% of the genome that we are making based on pre-existing heterozygosity. And the gold standard of functional testings, gene knockout tests, very little of it has been performed on humans, on mammals. It's unethical. So that's a prediction we're making right now. Now, a big part of our model would actually be, of course, death, degeneration, and extinction. That's what we would predict based on the fall. Now, we have a genome of 3 billion letters. If you take out one letter or change one letter randomly, are you going to have a huge fitness effect? It's going to have a tiny fitness effect, but in fact, it's like rust on a car. You can't see each rust event, but it's continuous and destructive. Moderator, how much more time do I have, brother?
You have you used up 8.5 minutes already. So
okay.
Yeah,
awesome.
That's, yeah.
Now, the question is, the downward curves, are they real? Because selection happens on the level of the whole organism. And it's absolutely evident based on all the empirical evidence that mutation selection cannot stop the loss of genomic information. So mutations in natural selection clearly cannot create genomes. Selection cannot stop the loss of information that is incredibly and immeasurably complex due to low impact deleterious mutation accumulation, which is happening on the molecular level. It's like trying to fix a computer with a hammer. It's just not going to happen. And this is what we predict under a literal interpretation of Genesis, the biblical based model. Evolutionists are just going to have to keep on imagining. Now, picture this, we're all a mutant. We transmit a small amount of mutations to our children. Even the evolutionists will admit that. 100 new mutations per person per generation, and genomes are devolving, and the genome is rusting out like a car. Take a room full of people. Now kill off the most mutant people. Now we have a room half full of people who still have approximately 100 more mutations than their parents. If everybody is multiply mutant, and if every generation is more mutant than the one before it, all selection can do is slow down the degeneration by killing off the absolute worst of the lot. But it doesn't stop mutations from accumulating in the population over time. Things are going down, not up. All modern scientific evidence points to the decay and destruction of an originally perfect design / creation. This is exactly what we predict based on a biblical-based model. Now, we're going to have to get into beneficial mutations because for numerous reasons that I'm going to get into, beneficial mutations cannot sufficiently compensate for the relentless influx of deleterious mutations. Based on the fact that we know the Bible records a time when people had extremely long lives, we can take this genetic entropy, this accumulation of mutations, to a point of least genetic entropy, which would be a point of creation and a point when people lived to these extremely long lives. Now, Taylor here is going to have to explain a way and how natural selection and beneficial mutations can counterbalance the accumulating mutations, because due to the influx of deleterious mutations, the rare occurrence of beneficial mutations cannot compensate for the information loss, of course, and the linkage itself is only going down. It's only getting worse and worse. It's only getting degenerate. Beneficials are rare.
1 minute left.
Thank you. Beneficials are rare, and I imagine Taylor's going to agree with me on this. And natural selection would be severely constrained by what's called selection interference, which we can get into more later, of course. But the problem is we now know that beneficial mutations are very rare, and non-neutral mutations are consistently deleterious, as anybody should expect with typographical errors and attacks. So the best beneficial mutations, and I want to see an example of a mutation that adds new, novel, and meaningful information, because most of them are reductive. And information loss is not going to take, of course, your fish to fisherman. So the bottom line is both evolutionists and creationists, they agree natural selection happens. Natural selection will only improve the worst, will remove the worst deleterious and detrimental mutations, and will only amplify the very best beneficial mutations. What does this indicate and suggest? The accumulating damage is largely invisible and unselectable. So it comes down to net gain versus net loss, and everything we know about genetics, everything we know about empirical data, proves biblical creation and disproves Ponscombe to people evolution. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you there, Standing for Truth, for that 12-minute opening. Now we'll just reset the clock, and the time will start for your opening statement. Snake was right, Taylor, when you're ready.
All right, thanks. So this is a fact in this field of biology, that with all these problems that Standing for Truth is bringing up, they're actually under study right now. And young Earth creationists basically take advantage of this gap in knowledge and assert that this is where their God resides. And it's the typical God of the gaps argument. And evolution is simply just the change of species populations through the generations. And every creationist, even the young Earth creationists, agree with this. They might not agree with this definition, but everyone agrees that change happens through species populations over the generations. We all agree that genes encode phenotypic traits, and we all agree that each generation can incrementally push populations to create branching populations with different traits. Evolution does not address how life began, only how it changes. And so the point of actual contention between us and the young Earth creationists is actually what is the original kind that we're dealing with that evolution describes the change of. Because evolution assumes a pre-existing living organism, or at least one organism, but probably a population of organisms. So the theory of evolution actually leaves ample room for this idea that God created all the animals on Earth, but they have to step outside the biblical literalist translation, because if you stay with the scientific community, then you're going to have to admit that the world is billions of years old and that we can trace our ancestry back to very simple organisms. And that's something that they want to try to avoid. See, young Earth creationists claim that life is extant in that most of their present forms and have evolved into subspecies since this recent creation event. But normal evolutionists debate that. Well, it's not really a debate anymore, but they hold the view that the Earth took billions of years to evolve life. So, sorry, there's dogs barking. You guys hear that?
That's okay.
All right.
So the young Earth creationists cannot demonstrate with any mechanism how these harmful mutations build up in all cases, and that is their case, because they have to prove that there are no cases in which these mutations are overcome. Because if there's even one case, that means that life can continue on and proliferate and then get another chance at that. We actually observe the opposite. We have models that are based on old evolutionary models that do assume that mutations would build up. And based on those models, we actually observe an under-dispersion of harmful alleles, as those old models, which they're outdated because we're actually researching this more and more and more, but the creationists are working with these outdated models. So they expect, rightly, because they're outdated and insufficient models, that we would see more mutations than we do. But there's actually a well-known paradox, because we predict these things, but we don't see them, meaning we need more research into this. So they essentially just take advantage of this gap in knowledge and to insert their religious worldview. Let's see. And it really, essentially, it rests on a giant conspiracy in the sciences against any supernatural explanation. And but that's not what science is. The young Earth creationists try to borrow the term science and appropriate the research to support their scriptures. They're trying to basically appropriate the legitimacy and the weight of the term science, but they don't want to be confined by naturalism or uniformitarianism, which they say is the flaw in science. But that comes along with science. So essentially you see them cherry picking at what they like and what they don't like. And so there's no real principle other than the Bible. And so it's not scientific. Essentially it's the position of trying to have your cake and eat it too. They want to be taken seriously in the scientific community, but they don't want to play by the rules of serious science. They want to explain things with supernaturalism, which would be just as empty and pointless as me saying that I can answer your question on how deleterious mutations accumulate over time by just saying, well, my God waved a magic wand and made them go away. It's not a very satisfying answer for either of us. So it's appealing to your God is essentially just a cop-out. So you don't have to do any of the actual science of connecting your ideas. How much time do I have left?
Well, you have about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
No, 6 minutes exactly.
Okay. So you can dispute the science all day long, but if you don't agree with naturalism, it's just don't call yourself a scientist. If you think that that's somehow lacking, then don't call yourself a scientist. Come up with something better than science, but so far we really haven't. And all science is a method. So yes, we assume that naturalism and uniformitarianism, because that is the process of science. Those are the premises of science, and you can't separate them. The science is the study of naturalistic processes, and the science works. So therefore, the premises of the science must be true to some degree, and that's how we know that it works. We didn't pick these principles arbitrarily. They're the principles that underlie the methods that work. So that's a huge distinction from just picking a religious text as your principle and using that as a guiding force, whereas we use processes that are self-evidently useful, and then we don't actually appeal to books. We could just compile what we found in them. I think moving on to, let's present some of the data right now. So there's this question of mutation accumulation, and essentially all of the studies that I read that were cited by the creationists, they predict an accumulation of slightly deleterious alleles only under certain conditions, like very small populations, under 1,000 individuals, or under high environmental stochasticity, which basically is just a very unstable environment. And we have several studies confirming basically that this only occurs under certain conditions. And so they haven't met their burden of proof. And even assuming that all slightly deleterious mutations accumulate absolutely with no exception, that doesn't disprove evolution one bit. It may be the case that we accrue mutations over time, and we may have an expiration date eventually, but that doesn't change the fact that genes are changing each generation. And so really I have a lot of the molecular evidence with me today, but I think I'm going to focus more on the fossil record this time, because personally, that is the most convincing evidence of evolution for me, even though I study the molecular aspects of cells. And that's very convincing to me. But what I can't find any other explanation for that creationists can account for is the fossil record, which is layered in such a way that we actually see simple organisms only at the bottom, and layering all the way to the top, we see these organisms, we see the populations change. So we don't actually see individual organisms, or we don't witness every single transitional step. But what we see is a population on one layer and a population on the next layer, and they're slightly different, but also very different. But the populations look similar, but they also look different. So we can go up and up and up and up the ladder, and what we see at the top is a lot of species that we don't find anywhere at the bottom, and what we find on the bottom is incremental steps as you follow it up the way that appear as if they're changing into all of our modern species. And so evolution essentially is an attempt to just explain what is the cause of biodiversity. So I think we basically agree on that evolution exists. What we're going to have to be debating tonight is whether or not the original forms that evolution concerns, how they changed into what we know today.
50 seconds.
We're going to have to, how much?
50 seconds.
Okay. We're going to have to figure out what that original form was, because evolution actually assumes working cellular mechanisms, all of that stuff that is supposedly so mind-bogglingly complex that it could never have arisen naturally, but that is a separate question. And by the way, those mechanisms are different in most cells, so there's actually a lot of flexibility and variability in that as well. But yeah, I guess that will end my opening statement.
One thing,
All right.
Samuel, forgive me for jumping in really quick. I just wanted to mention, I forgot to mention at the start, if anybody has a question, feel free to put it into the live chat. If you put in @ModernDayDebate at the start of your question, that'll make it highlighted for me, so it'll be a little bit easier for me to pull it out in case we've got all these other questions for people that are debating in the live chat. And also, if this is your first time here, feel free to subscribe. We'd love to have you come back. We are shooting for ideological diversity. So whether you're a Christian, atheist, you believe in evolution, creation, whatever it is, we're glad you're here, and we welcome you to be a part of the community. So with that, Samuel, thanks for your patience, and debaters, thanks for your patience for when I jumped in there. And last thing, we're new to the super chat thing. If you have a super chat, super chats, we will put you at the front of the list during the Q&A for your question or comment. And it also, as mentioned, allows you to do a comment towards one of the debaters from which they would respond to. So if you'd like to do that, that's an open option as well. And again, thanks for your patience and letting me cut in, guys.
No problem at all, James. Well, thank you both for that opening statement that both of you provided. We are now going to go into the rebuttal period. We'll begin with standing for truth with a 10-minute rebuttal period. I'll just, once again, 1 minute to time, I'll just indicate by just saying 1 minute, if that's all right with both of you. Standing for truth, your 10-minute rebuttal period starts as soon as you start.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much there, Taylor. I appreciate your opening there. You know what? We have met the burden of proof. 12,000 new deleterious mutation-related diseases are added every year to the database. That's obviously empirical evidence for this genome-wide degradation, because we see genetic entropy in real time. Alzheimer's disease, dementia, autism, asthma, autoimmune, cancers, immunological. There's a pandemic, and a lot of it is also based on epigenetic mutation. That means we're seeing entropic degeneration on all levels. And it's a fact that 700 billion mutations are accumulated this generation alone, 100 per person per generation. And that's 7 billion people on the planet, and most mutations are obviously in the non-selection zone. I mean, we see it in bacteria, we see it in paleogenomic evidence, we see it in mammoth populations carried a very high genetic load. Neanderthals were 40% less fit than modern humans. Homo naledi, the Hobbit, reductive evolution is seen in bacteria. I mean, it's just genome-wide degradation in all types of life, even in viruses. The H1N1 went from a red-hot pandemic to a whimper to an extinction event in only 90 years. This is genetic degeneration at work here. And he brought up the fossils as evidence as well. And the thing is, I brought forth testable and falsifiable predictions. And bones found in the dirt, bones are not inherited, traits are. That's why we look to genetics. Genetics on all levels proves biblical creation. I mean, the LMN haplogroups, 3 major haplogroups that fit exactly what we'd expect given a literal interpretation of Genesis. Low genetic diversity shows us that we all came from 2 people, Adam and Eve. And the Darwinists like Taylor here, they cite the circumstantial evidence of fossils of what they call, say, transitional forms as proof of common descent or just the layering of the fossils. But this type of evidence, it's just circumstantial evidence because it doesn't have an actual theory to cling to. And these apparent progressions, for example, that they bring up in the fossil record are, of course, predicated on the assumption of universal common descent and based on our model of built-in genetic diversity, this built-in capacity of animals to adapt independently to different environmental situations, perhaps even in a similar way to the finches that diverged from a single parental stock. We'd expect this biodiversity seen in the fossil record based on pre-existing heterozygosity, and the flood itself explains the fossil record. What we really see in the fossil record, the vast majority of fossils from top to bottom is marine fossils. It's 98% marine fossils, and they're mixed with land fossils. We find clams mixed with birds, mixed with horses, in all different strata. So the vast majority of fossils in the record are marine, exactly expected given what we know about the Genesis flood. We see, the evidence of animals running from the floodwaters. We even find animal tracks before we find the actual animals. And that's hard enough for the evolutionists to explain. The waters come in, recede slowly, gradually, burying organisms in their habitat, slowly building and progressing its way up. Mostly in the upper layers, what we see, though, is post-flood diversification and dispersion, which is obviously readily explainable through land bridges, floating mats. During the ice ages, birds distributing plants and other materials. Animals can be distributed around in very natural means during cataclysmic events. So, like I said, bones found in the dirt, they're not inherited, traits are. And the thing is, he talked about change in species. I agree that there's going to be change. We predict change based on our model of pre-existing functional DNA differences, of course, and a change in allele frequency and populations over time, all you want. What do we know? Dogs produce dogs. That doesn't mean that dogs and whales are related through common ancestry, because we need to see how that information can be built up to get your single cell to multi-cell to fish to amphibian to reptile to mammal to bird to monkey to man. I mean, there's going to be required phenomenal increases in expansion of genetic information. And the thing is, he looked to certain conditions, whether it's large populations, just looking at my notes here, population thresholds to explain away the accumulation of these low impact deleterious mutations. But like I showed in my opening, natural selection is obviously only selecting between mutant and more mutant. If we're all multiply mutant, the thing is, all natural selection can do is slow down the degeneration process, and a few rare beneficial mutations is not going to actually counterbalance the information loss. We see information loss on all levels, and we can't make the noise because there's too much genetic noise. We can't make the noise go away by invoking larger population sizes. Actually, one thing I had written down was naturalism. He has a naturalism bias. He even admitted himself that he has his own God in the gaps, because they're just studying this evidence, and yet they can't actually resolve it. I mean, they have rescue mechanisms like synergistic epistasis, mutation count mechanism, but it's all in the imagination. This type of evolution, pond scum to people evolution, only happens in the imagination of those that actually want to believe in it, because we see degeneration, death, decay of not only the universe is winding down, and we can point that back to a point of least entropy, a point of creation, as Genesis tells us, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, but also on a genomic level. And this genetic noise, it's always present and at much higher levels than is normally acknowledged by population geneticists. And all population geneticists, whether evolutionary or creationist, acknowledge the degeneration problem, and it's consistent with our model. And even if he wants to look to larger populations, different conditions, genetic noise destroys that, because very large populations invariably have enhanced noise, and larger population sizes extend over a wider range of environments, of course. So that means they're going to be subject to even more environmental variation and environmental pressures, negative pressures. And noise always remains a severe constraint to natural selection. Obviously, Taylor's talked about before in our previous discussions about artificial conditions, plant and animal breeding, for example. And yes, these breeders have been able to, very successfully select for a limited number of traits. And this is done through means of intelligence, which can minimize noise. But natural selection does none of this, and is nothing more than a blind and uncontrolled process subject to unconstrained noise and unlimited random fluctuation. So the no selection box, these near neutral unselectables, they build up in the population, and they cannot be waved away by the evolutionists. That's why the evolutionists imagine it's pseudoscience, because they don't have any testable predictions on these low impact near neutral deleterious mutations that are accumulating in our genome. And even by invoking larger population sizes, it's still going to show high levels of biological noise. So there's no rescue there. And evolution is all about rescue devices, convergent evolution, just rescue device after rescue device. And even junk DNA, these non-coding areas, and evolutionists will often tell you that 20% max is functional, but ENCODE themselves found that at least 80% of the non-coding DNA was transcribed into RNA, suggesting function. And this is our testable prediction, because the trajectory of discovery now favors genome-wide functionality. And this non-coding DNA, it functions much like a computer. It's involved in regulatory functions, embryonic development, timings of protein manufacture, but comprehensive knockout experiments, as I said in my opening, for a mammal have yet to be performed. So it's premature to make the claim that the majority of non-coding DNA is functional, but we're predicting that the vast majority is functional. And that's how we're going to identify the created kinds that he's talking about, because we're going to look for functionally unique differences across families if we're looking to the family level to identify kinds. So it's all about the testable predictions that actually flow from the hypothesis. And if we're looking to a family, we can see in orphan genes, taxonomically restricted genes, we can see that this actually disproves common ancestry.
1 minute.
And of itself. He's going to have to show me actual examples of beneficial mutations that are not deleterious in any way, because at the end of the day, if it comes down to a net loss versus a net gain of information, and all known examples of beneficial mutations are involving decay of prior information. I mean, even gene duplications, a few rare, say, beneficial duplications, they're not going to offset the many accumulating deleterious duplications, let alone all the other accumulating mutations. So it's all about a net loss versus a net gain, and most beneficials are reductive, and things are obviously not being taken forward. They're actually degrading. And this type of pond scum to people evolution it's impossible. I didn't see a model being put forth. I didn't see any of even evolutionist best evidence, whether it's nested hierarchies, phylogenetic systematics, pseudogenes, genetic markers.
5 seconds.
So hopefully he can bring some of that up, because I've made testable predictions. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Standing for Truth, for that rebuttal period. Now we'll just head over to SnakeWasRight. Just a second while I reset the clock. Your time starts as soon as you start speaking.
All right. I'm not sure what testable predictions he's talking about. If the biblical model were true, what we would see from the flood event is essentially everything all mixed up in the same level. We wouldn't see different layers with different populations. We'd expect everything to be buried in a single layer and evenly distributed. And I don't know if anyone else caught this, but he said that 90% of the fossils are marine animals, and that just does not comport with the biblical model at all. If 90% of the animals that died in the flood were marine, it just doesn't make sense. They can swim. They live in the water. So most of the animals would have to have been terrestrial animals. And in the case of a global flood, I don't know how long it's supposed to have lasted. I don't think over a year. We would not see very many layers, and we would see an even distribution of animals. So that just completely blows out of the water any possible ideation that any young Earth creationist has. But I'm going to go over the rest of the science too, because I think that you're reading it wrong. So first of all, I'm not a Darwinist. Darwinists believe only in natural selection, because Darwin did not have access to genetics. He didn't know anything about them. He didn't know what genes were, anything about that. We are researching a lot of different evolutionary mechanisms now, down to the molecular level, and they're basically taking advantage of this and saying it's a gap, it's a God of the gap situation here, while he's doing the same thing. But what we're doing is we're taking the results that we see. Sorry, guys. We're taking the results that we see, which is that some populations do not accrue deleterious mutations, and we're trying to explain that. And we have a lot of different explanations. We get more all the time. So let's see, I'm gonna try and screen share this time. Okay. Can you see it?
Yep.
All right, so basically what we're dealing with is outdated theories of evolution. So we have this old theory of advantageous mutations are rapidly fixed, disadvantageous are rapidly eliminated, and neutral accumulate. And this evolved into nearly neutral mutations because we found out that a lot of these things don't have much of a, that these actually are not totally neutral, they have a small effect. There is a paper in here that talks about that most of them are actually, most of the nearly neutral mutations are mutations to regulatory function, and therefore that's why they're nearly neutral, and because they don't have as much of an effect. And so let's see here. Anyway, there are lots of different mechanisms that we do this, so let's go over one of them. This is from a study on epistasis, and so basically what you see here is beyond this red line in all these different samplings, this is loss of function. So all these buildups of genes that you see on to the right of the red line, they all die. So what you're left with is these that don't have any. And essentially what this is caused by is a high variance. And essentially that creates a really large distribution to select from. So, and this is caused by the synergistic interactions between these different mutations. So you will actually get some combinations that aren't deleterious at all, some that are barely deleterious, and a few, most of them that will cause loss of function. And beyond the loss of function line, that will be selected out very quickly. But over here, it actually recombines them and has a different effect. And we select for the ones with the least mutations. And so, let's see. But I want to go over the fact that he's using this accumulation of mutations as a red herring, because it doesn't really matter. You can't disprove evolution by saying that mutations accumulate. These changes are still observed and still occur. And so that it doesn't really matter. Let's see here. I'm just gonna go through some of the papers. He says there's no evidence of these things. So this is from the same paper that I just showed you the charts from. It says negative or purifying selection prevents the unlimited accumulation of deleterious mutations and establishes a mutation selection equilibrium. It's from the same paper. The situation becomes quite different if slightly advantageous mutations occur at a constant rate, independent of environmental conditions. In this case, the evolutionary rate can be enormously higher in species with a larger population size than in the species with small population size, contrary to the observed pattern of evolution at the molecular level. There's a paper called Quantifying the Slightly Deleterious Mutation Model of Molecular Evolution, and they found that about 10% or fewer mutations seem to behave as slightly deleterious mutations. So it's really not as big a problem as he tries to make it out, and it doesn't affect whether evolution happens or not. If we're all evolving towards a state of genetic decay, if we're all going to lose function and become disease-ridden, cancerous blobs, that's still evolution. We're still going to see change of population through time. In a paper called Genetic Constraints on Protein Evolution, so the young Earth creationists have this genetic constraint theory where they think that the buildup of deleterious alleles will constrain evolution to just kinds differentiating in, like, a tiger can never, or a cat can never become a non-cat, something like that. From this paper, we see deleterious effects of adaptive mutations are subsequently suppressed through the fixation of compensatory mutations. Typically, suppression occurs within the time frame of the adaptation and often involves multiple compensatory mutations. So not all mutations affect every individual differently because we all have different mutations. So some configurations are actually going to suppress the effects of other mutations. So we literally have tons of papers talking about this effect. Let's go to the next one. Actually, this is from the same paper. A large portion of positively selected mutations appear to be compensatory, suppressing deleterious pleiotropic effects of adaptive mutation. And pleiotropic is just essentially the synergistic effects between the different mutations. So you're going to have a wide range of variance between these different buildups. They're going to have less and more, and you're also going to have a wide variance of the effect that this has on the organism, because each different variant has a different effect on each different organism. So you could have the same mutations as someone, but they might be deleterious for you and beneficial for them.
1 minute.
Okay. I'll skip ahead a little bit. There's a paper called The Loss of Function of Sarcomeres Saccharomyces, if that's a hard word. Kinesin-related SYN8 and KIP1 is suppressed by CAR3 motor domain protein mutations. So there's just tons of examples of where we actually see mutations making up for other mutations. And I will end with one of his citations about Neanderthal genes introgressing into the human population, and we actually observe a slowed spread of these genes because they were less fit. And so there is actually, we observe that there are cellular mechanisms editing out these deleterious mutations. We don't know quite all of them yet. And so the young Earth creationists
5 seconds.
And I'll just end there.
Well, thank you very much, Taylor. Snake was right, and also to Standing for Truth, that intriguing rebuttal period. Now we're going to go to not a cross-examination, but a 20-minute period of open discussion. Now, what I thought I'll do is just start out by maybe just throwing a topic in there, and you guys could pick it up from there if that's all right. So I'll reset the clock to just 20 minutes. Now, of course, remember, for those of you just tuning in, you can, of course, post your questions in, just tag Modern Day Hysteria, and of course, we'll have a Q&A period right after this. But now, the 20-minute discussion period, I'll begin by letting Standing for Truth have the first say, and then you can pick it up from there. The question I want to throw in as an introductory discussion point is that Snake was right, insisted that the fossil record simply demonstrates, kind of proves his point of view, and if the flood really was an explanation to that, you should see one single layer instead of the different layers that we have now in the fossil record. Does that disprove creation? Let's start with you, Standing for Truth.
Sure, I can certainly address that. I appreciate your rebuttal there. It just seems like everything he said was a lot of storytelling, a lot of imagining, because it seems like, according to him, evolution answers up, down, in and out, living, dying, breathing and not breathing. It just answers everything. I mean, we see entropic degeneration on all levels, all this thousands of mutation-related diseases, and yet the fact that beneficial mutations are rare, and obviously they can't make up or compensate for the information loss, it's still evidence for fish to fisherman evolution. So I find that absurd. But in regards to like I said, fossils, bones found in the dirt, they're not inherited traits. That's why I look to genetics to demonstrate my model. That's why I've made testable predictions. But at the end of the day, if he wants a testable prediction for, the CPT model, the catastrophic plate tectonics model that I look to explain the geology, I mean, I can give him that, since if he's looking specifically for a testable prediction on that. I mean, is that what you're looking for, Taylor?
Not really. Unless that's been approved by mainstream scientists. But I'm really looking more for something that you can predict that will show up in the fossil layer, which everything about the flood predicts that it would look completely different.
Well, the thing is, if you look to Genesis and you look to our actual
why
flood
are we
model,
looking to Genesis at all?
but I'm saying
Why
that
is
if
that your starting point?
We'll let him just answer that, and then, of course, I'll pass it back to you, Taylor.
the scope and scale of the energy produced by the flood, according to Genesis, would have been astounding. And the fountains of the great deep breaking up, that's what we look to. So the earth is fractured like an eggshell. Continents are moving vertically, horizontally, and tsunamis, they drive floodwaters onto the continents. The rain is unending, and it's just geologic catastrophism. And that's why all these marine fossils that are found, these clams, they're already at the bottom. So that's why we would see 80% of them are consisting of the actual fossil record. But the thing is, this continent, the continents are moving at rapid paces. It's like a sprint. The evolutionists look to continental drift, but we look to initial continental sprint, and it's through the floodwaters and all this geological havoc. But here's the testable prediction we've made on that, because if we don't make a testable prediction, just like I make testable predictions on pre-existing heterozygosity, we also make testable predictions on the CPT model. And the pre-flood ocean crust is dragged down into the mantle. That's called subduction process. So the testable prediction would be that the cold ocean crust should still be cold, since this occurred only thousands of years ago, even though it has descended into the deep hot mantle. Now, what's amazing is that seismic data, and I can give you this article and the audience the article from NASA, has actually revealed enormous slabs of cool rock under North America. And down in the core itself, which should be warm, this is confirmation of the catastrophic plate tectonics model. So all the phenomenon, everything we see fits that basic hypothesis of catastrophic plate tectonics. I'm not sure what else you could be looking for. Go ahead.
But Snake was right. You were saying that why refer to Genesis, right? You can carry that on.
Yeah.
Well, what do you have to say about the testable prediction that I made? Because if I put forth a model based on Genesis, it's pseudoscience if there's no testable predictions that flow from it. But based on the fact that the pre-flood ocean crust is dragged down into the mantle, which is called subduction process, based on the fountains of the Great Deep breaking open. I'm not sure if you've read the account in Genesis of the fountains of the Great Deep breaking open, but like I said, the Earth is fractured like an eggshell. The continents are moving not only vertically but horizontally. So seismic data from NASA has revealed this, these enormous slabs of cool rock under North America. So that is a confirmed prediction. But like I said, fossils, bones found in the dirt, they're not inherited. Traits are. So if we're looking at the origins of species, which is the name of this debate, we need to look at what is inherited, and traits are inherited. So, I mean, we can continue talking about, flood geology if you want, but I didn't really see any actual evidence being presented for universal common ancestry. So take your time, address what I said. Curious as to your opinion and thoughts on the testable prediction we've made given a model of catastrophic plate tectonics, but I'd like to see your evidence for the origin of species, not just a random change in allele frequency and populations over time, but actual evidence. Go ahead.
All right.
The evidence is in the fact that every population is different in each layer. We wouldn't see that in a flood model, and we wouldn't see 90% of the death being animals that survive in water.
So you're, see, the thing is, fossils, it's just, I've already given you a testable falsifiable prediction based on our model, catastrophic plate tectonics. So I mean, I don't really.
It's not unique though. It's
No,
like predicting that the sun will come up. We already know that the sun will come up.
No, because that's actually a pretty sufficient prediction and confirmation based on that model. But like I said, I mean, if you're going to look to the fossil record, and even though it's just circumstantial evidence requiring an actual theory to account for the large scale evolution, but all we see is a net loss of information, and the fact that natural selection is severely constrained by selection interference. I mean, how are you gonna, can you give me a few beneficial mutations that are not somewhat deleterious? I mean, how are you gonna build, because if you're looking to the lower levels of the simple organisms, and I wouldn't say a trilobite is simple by any means, it's certainly complex, look at the eye, but how are you gonna account for that information buildup? Where's the novelty?
Well, that doesn't actually matter. We can start with, evolution starts with a pre-assembled DNA and cellular mechanism. So we start with genes. So we can just lose information. That's fine. It doesn't matter.
Well, no, because if these beneficial mutations that you agree are rare and they can seldom make the type of compensation that's needed to stop the net loss of information, you're not gonna, it's like taking 2 steps forward, but then taking 10 steps backward. You're never gonna climb that mountain, and you're never gonna get your fish to fisherman. It's a pseudo-scientific belief, but you can believe in it all you want, Taylor, but I haven't seen any evidence being presented the entire time. You're looking to the fossil record, but bones found in the dirt are not inherited. Traits are. Where's your evidence, genetically speaking? I mean, what do you look to, brother?
You're welcome to check their math, but I just read off to you like 4 or 5 studies where they conclude the exact opposite of what you're saying.
Well, the thing is, you look to, for one, I'll go to, those studies and mechanisms, but where's your example of a beneficial mutation? Because I agree that there are mutations that are beneficial given, and they're environmentally dependent, of course. I mean, even looking at, sickle cell anemia, for example, it's still ultimately reductive, but at the end of the day, there is some type of benefit to be had from it. But where's your novel gain in information there, Taylor? Go ahead.
Well, it's context dependent. Not all mutations are going to cause disease in every individual. And so the fact that there's such high variance is how we get away with it. I talked to you last time we talked. So you still don't understand how gaining an antifreeze function to your blood is a beneficial mutation?
Well, the thing is, I'm not disagreeing with adaptations. And the thing is, it's funny that the only example you can go to is these notothinioid antifreeze Arctic fish, the antifreeze proteins, because all it is a story. They're looking at it, it's already occurred, and they're making judgments and inferences. Where's your real time? And the thing is, it's probably an epigenetic, non-random genetic change. Anyways, these fish go into the cold water, and all of a sudden they have these antifreeze proteins that they develop based on pre-existing genetic adaptation. But where's your actual, observable evidence? Not looking at some story, because I know evolutionists like to imagine and storytell, but you're talking about a trade-off here. You're talking about that it's context dependent, but while the genome is degenerating in many possible ways, Taylor, and while a few nucleotide sites may be improving, based on this context dependent beneficial mutations, huge numbers are being degraded. So this type of trade-off you're talking about, it's obviously not sustainable, as it's still going to result in a shrinking functional genome size. So once again, you can believe in it all you want, and I put a capital B on believe, but it's just a science fiction based religion with no actual empirical evidence. I mean, you still haven't presented us any evidence. You look to some bones found in the dirt. I've given you a testable falsifiable prediction based on our model of catastrophic plate tectonics. Where's your evidence for pond scum to people evolution? Go ahead.
Well, you're kind of all over the place here. So most of these mutations are only slightly deleterious because they're regulatory mutations. So I cited you several papers that talk about compensatory mutations. So one mutation can up and down regulate all these weird tinkerings that you had and just solve it all. And Dr. Seidgart, when he talked with Nephilim, he brought up how birds were losing eyesight function, and then all of a sudden they got a mutation and everything started working better. And that's there's another paper that examines biological systems with anti-fragility and examines how you can mess with the system and it will still have the same functionality.
Well, the thing is, when you look to redundancy in, say, a computer, this backup code, you look at that and think, wow, what incredible design. But when you look at the redundancy in a genome, and let's say there's a mutation in that redundancy, in that backup code, I mean, of course, it's going to be deleterious, and it's evidence of design. And how does natural selection build something like redundancy, this backup code in the genome, when natural selection looks to the short term, but yet these redundant elements are actually built for the long term? So I don't agree that compensating for loss of information is possible at all, Taylor. I mean, I don't think you've demonstrated
with the science.
Well, the thing is, you're saying
what it all comes down to is your guys' whole argument hangs on a conspiracy in the sciences.
Well, no, it's not a conspiracy, because that's what we see: death, degeneration. We see mutations or destruction, not construction. And the thing is, the whole genome is degenerating and throwing out so much information while trying to make up for it with a few beneficial mutations that you're talking about. That's not going to solve the problem. That's wishful thinking.
We actually see the opposite, and we're trying to explain that.
So you're trying to explain that, and you see the opposite, even though we see entropic degeneration on all level. I mean, 12,000 mutation-related diseases. I mean, where's your beneficial mutations in man? We see thousands of Mendelian-related mutations. Can you even give me one that's not somewhat deleterious? I mean, you're not fooling anybody in believing that losing information is going to build your genome. I mean, it's just not even. It's absurd, to say the least.
Imagine you're playing Scrabble and you have you can spell amazing, and you remove a Z and an A, and now you have amazing, and it spells something. It's the same thing. You can duplicate letters and you get more stuff to work with.
Well, the thing is, if you're duplicating an already degenerate gene based on the accumulation of these low impact near neutral mutations, you're probably just going to speed up the degeneration process. And the thing is, if I give you a copy of a book that you already own, and the thing is you start introducing typographical errors in that second copy of the book you already own, all you have is a more messed up copy of that original book. So things are not being taken forward, and all we see is devolution. The origin of species is better explained from a creationist, biblical-based model perspective, because we expect change, but we expect change based on information loss, and that's exactly what we see. I mean, I have a paper here that talks about functional DNA making the problem even worse. And the thing is, the evidence for genome-wide functionality is strong. It's preliminary, but the trajectory is strong. But this paper talks about that even if the genome is only 10% functional, evolution is impossible. And I think you would even agree that the genome is more than 10% functional, would you not?
It's probably about 10, maybe more.
Okay, so, well, for one, I think the evidence is outstanding for it being more than, because the thing is, how much do we know about the developmental process, for example, and that
A lot. And it confirms evolution, because on our embryonic stages, we look like our past, we express basically genes that were present phenotypically in adults of our past ancestors.
But the thing is, how does, so tell me, how does coding and non-coding DNA coordinate when, where, and how, you know, these structures are sequentially put in place to produce a fully functional organism? Like, can you explain to me the step-by-step process on a molecular level on how you go, how the coding and non-DNA coding actually coordinate? I mean, they know very little, because a lot of these genes, well, for one, you agreed that, you know, knockout experiments for a mammal have yet to be performed, and yet you're saying that the genome is probably only 10% functional. I mean, isn't that kind of premature, Taylor?
No, it's based on mutation rates. So if mutation rates accumulate in the higher end of realistic levels, then what was the study saying? It basically just says that it's comparing mutation rates with a functional genome. So the higher the functional genome is, the more deleterious effects you'll find from a mutation rate. And so we've predicted that there's a functional range of like 10 to 25% based on our ability to basically the breeding rate.
So are you saying that the genome can only be 10% functional, even though ENCODE revealed preliminary data? I'm not saying that it's, you know, 100% evidence, but it is preliminary that at least 80% of the genome is transcribed in RNA. So that at least suggests that the genome's not idle. And when the fact that we know very little about the developmental process and how coding and non-DNA coding coordinate with each other. I mean, are you just saying that the genome has to be 10% functional because of this paper that says 10% or more completely destroys pawns come to people evolution? Like, do you, because it seems like that type of belief is going to hinder scientific advancement, because now.
No, because we don't make assumptions. We say that it's a prediction, and if it doesn't come true, then we go back to the model. We're researching the stuff. But that doesn't mean we get to go, oh, well, just, we don't know, therefore God did it. This is science. It constantly, we went from the neutral theory of mutation accumulation to the nearly neutral theory. And now we know that they're only low impact, slightly deleterious, because most of these that we're talking about are occurring in the majority of the gene code, which is non-functional. Or
see, but the thing is, as I talked about earlier, portion
impact, because it's regulatory, and regulatory functions are very easy to up and down regulate with epigenetics, all kinds of different things.
Well, the thing is, ENCODE has actually revealed that most nucleotides play a role in multiple overlapping codes. So contrary to pond scum to people evolution, that actually makes any beneficial mutations, which are not deleterious at some level, vanishingly rare. And as I said earlier, portions of the genome involved specifically in embryological development were not evaluated. So systematic knockout experiments, as we're predicting based on the model of pre-existing heterozygosity, can only fully demonstrate this. So why don't we get into the lab and see which prediction involving the non-coding DNA regions are actually true? Because the thing is, if you're saying that the genome's only 10% functional, which I think that's just false, it's false, you know, flat on its face, because the trajectory is already pointing to genome-wide functionality. We just need to perform these systematic knockout experiments to fully demonstrate that fact. So if you have to stick to the fact that, you know, you want to believe the genome's only 10%, 20% functional because even evolutionists are saying in secular papers that any more than that means that we would degenerate too fast, that evolution couldn't be true. But the thing is, like, you still haven't given any, I've given evidence from the 3 major haplogroups, low genetic diversity, 1 Y chromosome, 1 mitochondrial DNA, the fact that genes come in 2 versions. I mean, this is all predicted by the Bible thousands of years ago. I've given you a testable, falsifiable prediction from the catastrophic plate tectonics model, and I've shown you death, degeneration, and decay of the universe and the genome based on the account of Genesis and the fall. So you haven't given us any evidence yet. So did you want to spend some time giving some evidence for universal common descent there, Taylor?
Well, you have about 75 seconds to do that. So yeah, Taylor, go ahead, Taylor.
Yeah, you take your time. Give some evidence, brother, because the debate's almost done and you haven't given any. Go ahead.
I've already done that multiple times, but I don't really care. We also have back mutation, by the way, which can flip a gene back to its wild form. But I don't care.
Well, back mutations are rare, so.
We'll just let him finish that. Yeah,
okay, go ahead.
It doesn't really matter. It's a red herring, because let's assume we started with all we're going to get, genetically speaking, and we developed from there, and we just devolved and lost information from there. That's still evolution, and you still can't provide anything that can resolve the biblical theory with what we find in the fossil record, because what we would actually find is an even distribution of all taxa, and you can't find a mammal in the lower layers. You just can't.
All right, last 15 seconds.
Okay, so I hope the audience has been able to see that no actual evidence has been provided for the evolutionary model. So by default, I win. So this has been fun. But yeah, we'll go to our closing statements then, and I'll debunk what you just said there.
All right. Well, thank you both once again for that really fascinating 20-minute of discussion. We will now head to the final part of the formal debate, which will be the closing presentations. We'll start first with Standing for Truth. Your 5 minutes begin as soon as you start.
1 second. Samuel, if you have to go, okay. I know that you have an appointment. It's totally okay. I don't want to keep you here longer than for your appointment.
All right. No worries, man. I'll finish this, and after this, I'll head over.
Thanks, buddy.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks so much. Yeah, I've given, plenty of testable, falsifiable predictions. I've given you confirmed predictions based on the catastrophic plate tectonics model. He's given no actual evidence for universal common descent. He's gone to rescue devices to explain away the accumulating damage. I've already debunked that based on the fact that the genetic noise is just too much to look to any type of rescue device. And synergistic epistasis, as he talked about in his rebuttal there, the thing is, to the extent there is substantial amount of synergistic epistasis happening, it actually makes the genetic situation worse, not better. And very, very extensive numerical simulation experiments has actually falsified the synergistic epistasis mechanism. But I have to applaud him for actually bringing up some arguments and some rescue devices for genome-wide degradation based on low impact deleterious mutations, because everyone else that I've debated, they really came unprepared, and there's no way to resolve the problem. And it's a lot of imagining and just so stories, but at least he tried, which is nice. But evolutionists, like I said, they hope, they dream, they imagine that, dogs and pine trees are related through common ancestry. But the thing is, it's just not true. It falls in the realm of pseudoscience. And even when there is very strong synergistic epistasis, it fails to curb deleterious mutation accumulation. Instead, what it does is it causes accelerated genetic degeneration and rapid extinction. But what's to be taken from this is that these primary escape mechanisms, synergistic epistasis, for example, mutation count mechanism, even the back mutations he just talked about, they're exceedingly rare. And even when they do happen, based on the amount of deleterious mutations that are flooding the genome and being transmitted from generation to generation, it's as if there's no back mutations at all. But at least he tried, unlike most of the other evolutionists, so that's nice. But these primary escape mechanisms used by evolutionists, they're artificial, contrived, and are profoundly unrealistic biologically. So the majority of beneficial mutations, they're going to escape positive selection, and the few rare beneficials will then have high impact. But these isolated high impact beneficials will only allow for adaptive episodes. And these rare anomalies happen even while the rest of the genome is undergoing systematic degeneration. So I've already presented a ton of examples for genetic entropy in real time. And I've demonstrated that, you know, natural selection is constrained hugely by selection interference, because selecting for one trait interferes with selecting for another trait. And when you have billions of traits segregating in the population, then the selection process starts to work against itself. And that means you end up with being able to only select the best and the worst mutations, as I've been talking about the entire time. I feel it's as if evolutionists just don't even listen, because anybody should be able to easily see that most mutations fall within this no selection zone, and that almost all of them are deleterious. But all evidence becomes evidence for pond scum to people evolution. But the fact is, even with strong, generous selection, if you wanted to give that to them, this entire no selection zone only undergoes complete degeneration. So it's funny because Taylor speaks of the obvious, right? Natural selection, adaptation, few beneficial mutations, but anybody with a basic understanding of genetics understands and knows these things. So the argument of genetic entropy only begins after acknowledging these obvious things, and his rescue device mechanisms, they're not going to account for the relentless influx of deleterious mutations. And the thing is, I've given a testable model based on pre-existing functional DNA differences, and their most claimed evidence anyways, phylogenetic systematics, for example, it's mostly based on the concept of outdated junk DNA. And as we talked about in our 20-minute discussion, DNA functions are only beginning to be found during the last decade, meaning we understand less than 5%. How much longer?
40 seconds.
Meaning we understand, you know, much less than 5% of the DNA language. It'd be like me going to Russia, reading a book, and then telling them what's a mistake and what's not. We understand so little of the DNA language. So the trajectory strongly suggests the vast majority of DNA will be functional. And this takes away from the primary assumption of evolutionary phylogenetics, which is primarily based on mutations in pseudogenes. We know pseudogenes are very important functionally as well. And if the vast majority of DNA is functional, as we're seeing, becomes a common design argument, as creationists have always predicted, the vast majority of DNA is functional. So evolution has to deal with the many problems, and then they invoke rescue device after rescue device. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for keeping to time as well. Standing for truth. We'll now have the final 5-minute closing presentation from SnakeWasRight. Taylor, time starts when you begin.
All right. So you already admit that there are processes that I'm trying to describe. You admit that there are processes that slow this process of degeneration. And these processes are numerous: synergistic epistasis, genetic purging, anti-fragility, modularity, assortative mating, balancing selection, directional selection, disruptive selection, fluctuating selection, coinophilia, mutation selection, balance, stabilizing selection, dysgenics, and I assume there are others. And so he says these are exceedingly rare, but there are, as you can see, numerous different processes going on all the time. And these are just to explain the facts that we already know, which is that their old model, the constraint model based on buildup of mutation, is not observed. We actually, I read the study earlier, it over-predicts what we actually see. So what we see is an under-dispersion of deleterious alleles and an over-dispersion of genetic variants. And that's because that's epistasis, which is, it causes different variants based on how the different mutations interact with each other. So it's not just a linear degradation where each trait just adds on top of another. And that actually increases the selection visibility. So these near neutral mutations, there are thousands, or not thousands, but many different ways that we can regulate them, because most of them are just regulatory mutations anyway. Let's see here. In Mutation predicts 40 million years of flywing evolution. They say, here we show that the metapopulation structure, habitat loss, or fragmentation, environmental stochasticity can be expected to greatly accelerate the accumulation of mildly deleterious mutations. And he already admits that there are processes which slow the accumulation of deleterious mutations. So all we're doing is just studying how these processes work, and we're actually observing that there are cases in which all these, we have mathematical functions, which I doubt you'll understand, but I named the studies and I'll link them to you to check out later. But we actually understand how all these work, and the way that they interact mathematically, we see that there are populations that make it through. And that's not just with the computer models, that's actually with real fly populations. We see an underprediction or an overprediction of deleterious alleles, which we don't actually see in reality. From that original study that I cited, the situation becomes quite different if slightly advantageous mutations occur at a constant rate. Or actually, sorry, I'm reading the wrong thing. Okay, this is also from the flying wing paper. In principle, the constraint hypothesis could be rescued if the vast majority of deleterious mutations... I lost it. Sorry, guys. All right. Could be rescued if the vast majority of deleterious mutations were so deleterious that they cannot contribute to evolution. But this requires the implausible assumption that deleterious mutations have the same pattern of effects as potentially advantageous ones. So all of the science disagrees explicitly with Standing for Truth's model. And
1 minute.
so I will just conclude again with the strongest evidence of the fossil record. You haven't made any. There were very weak predictions, just like predicting that the sun will come up. So, and all of your predictions based on the model of how we would see the fossils build up based on the flood doesn't comport with reality, because we see layers with progressively different populations. If the flood model was true, we would see mostly land animals dead, not 90% marine animals. And we would also find an even distribution. We would find Precambrian rabbits. We would find mammals down in the sections where we don't find any vertebrates at all. So until the creationists, the young Earth creationists, because real creationists are not other creationists believe in the evolutionist model, but until the young Earth creationists can explain why the flood layered everything in such a particular way, then I will remain unconvinced.
All right, that's it then. Thank you, Taylor, for that presentation as well, and thank you once again to Standing for Truth. Both of you have intrigued us, and hopefully the viewers watching at home as well, who will now get a chance to participate in this dialogue in the Q&A section. I hand the time over to James. James, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Samuel. We're thrilled to have you, buddy. Oh, and by the way, just wanted a quick mention. Samuel's link is now in the description. So Samuel has his own channel. It's called Explain Apologetics. Highly encourage you to check out Samuel. He's been just a huge blessing to this channel in so many ways, in helping us kind of promote this, what we're hoping is a nonpartisan channel where we can give everybody a fair shake. And so encourage you. Samuel's just a terrific guy. You're going to love him. So thanks again for coming on, Samuel.
Thanks so much. My pleasure.
You bet. Take care, Samuel.
Take care.
So I'm going to quick switch around the pictures. When we have somebody check out from Zoom, it's normal where we have the pictures scramble. And normally I panic. But it's been such a long day. I'm just too tired to. So I'm stoked to get into these questions. Thank you guys so much. This is a blast. Don't worry, I'm going to be working on the picture. If you notice, it looks a little bit funny, but don't worry, we'll get to that. And I'm going to read your questions in the meantime. We're going to have a short Q&A. Sorry, we got started a little bit late, so it's just I've got a ton of homework and kind of trying to hammer out my doctorate right now. So it's like it's really hard time-wise. That's the one thing that is really hard to manage sometimes. So Himsake, thanks so much for your super chat. We appreciate it. And Himsake said, thanks, James. Really appreciate your channel. So, well, Himsake, we really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. That means a lot to have your support. And Brian Stevens, thanks so much for your super chat. Glad to have you here, buddy. And he says, if you're wrong about non-coding DNA, is creationism wrong? So that's a question, I think, for Standing for Truth. So if you'd like, I can read that again for you.
What's the question? Sorry, James.
That's all right. He asked, if you're wrong about non-coding DNA, is creationism wrong?
Well, what's nice is a lot of times these models, for example, the LMN haplogroups, the mitochondrial DNA model that's being presented and that has made testable and falsifiable predictions, especially on the subnodes that we see on that phylogenetic tree. And then the non-coding DNA regions being functional and the preliminary data is pointing to genome-wide functionality is a testable prediction on created heterozygosity. But if that's not, if that prediction doesn't come true and that prediction is falsified, say, the model's adaptive. So at the end of the day, it wouldn't disprove creationism. It would just mean that we need to go and make more solid predictions based on our model. But so far, more and more accumulating papers are coming out suggesting important functions, pseudogene specific genetic markers are being overturned, and the junk DNA paradigm really has been overturned. So that's a prediction that I think is being confirmed and is going to be even more confirmed down the road when we understand the DNA language even more. I hope that answers this question. Thanks, James.
You bet. Thanks for that question, Brian Stevens, your super chat as well. We appreciate it. And thanks for your answers, Standing for Truth. And Justin R., thanks so much for your super chat, bud. And he says, thanks, James, for setting up the channel. Keep it up. Thanks so much. I appreciate that, Justin. We're really encouraged that you are enjoying it. So we're thrilled to have you here, too, and that we all get to enjoy this together. So it means a lot. And always hold us accountable, whether it be, I don't know if I mentioned, Samuel will be actually he'll be sometimes taking the lead on moderating where I won't even be here. Especially on theology. He loves theology. I do too, but not as much as Samuel. So we are going to have Samuel sometimes, or it'll just be Samuel, and I will be probably trying to do homework or whatever. So it's almost always I'm going to be doing homework. But next one, thanks so much for your guys' super chats. Crag Nightwolf emailed, and he said, if your model of, and this is kind of the setup for the question, if your model of genetic entropy truly has predictive powers like evolution, then that can be relied upon, please make a prediction on which specific organisms we should be seeing going extinct, and specifically how far in the near future due to your supposed knowledge of genetic entropy.
So for sure, we should see higher mammals going extinct based on mutation accumulation more quickly. Something like a bacteria, I mean, it goes through more rounds of selection, has more generation times, and should degenerate slower. But the thing is, reductive evolution is also common in bacteria as well. And Lenski himself is demonstrating reductive evolution adaptation via genetic degeneration, loss of genes. So even bacteria we can now predict are not going forward, evolutionary speaking. So we would certainly predict, though, that mammals, humans are going to degenerate faster, and we've already got plenty of examples of entropic degeneration on all levels. So we know how many mutations are accumulated and passed on from generation to generation, and genomes are devolving, and the genome's rusting out like a car. So that would be the prediction that we actually viruses we predict would degenerate very fast as well. And that's why there's been important work done on the human version of the flu, H1N1, and it's gone from a red hot pandemic to a whimper to an extinction event. And I think it's 90 years. So you can look up the paper on that. I think it's peer reviewed and published in the NIH journal. So plenty of predictions and already some confirmations as well. So thanks for the question. I appreciate it.
Well, can I add something on to that a little bit?
You bet. As long
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Yeah. So I don't understand under your model why there's different things going extinct at different rates, because, and also the H1N1 went extinct in humans because they're not a human virus. So I don't understand how the Neanderthals, why did they branch off from humans and go extinct before the rest of us?
Well, the thing is, the Neanderthals were a subpopulation of humans that branched off and isolated themselves after the Tower of Babel and probably during the Ice Age. So a lot of it was due to inbreeding, because inbreeding exposes the genetic mistakes within the genome. But the thing is, like I've said before, inbreeding, it's like a sneak preview of where we are going genetically as a species. So if you want to know where we're going based on these accumulation of mutations, you can look at examples like mammoth populations, Neanderthal populations. That's all I got to say.
Doesn't that explain that there's something going on that's slowing down the mutation of others in comparison?
What's that? You kind of cut out there.
Doesn't that demonstrate that there's something between those who are going extinct quickly and those who aren't, that there's some kind of something slowing down the accumulation of mutation?
Well, natural selection based on larger populations could probably slow down the degeneration process. But the thing is, it's not going to be able to stop the degeneration process. In viruses and bacteria, as I said, those microbes would be expected to degenerate slowly because mutation rate per genome is low and selection is intense and continuous, as I've said. But like I said, even the RNA virus has been shown to be subject to genetic entropy. And you can read that paper as well. I think found in the NIH journal.
We've done the math, and there are things we can do to overcome the accumulation. So I don't understand where you get the basis that you can.
No, because there's extensive numerical simulations. For example, synergistic epistasis has been sufficiently falsified. So I can send you that paper as well. But Dr. John Sanford has studied this more than any other population geneticist. I mean, Kimura, his model was oversimplified. The no selection zone, beneficial mutations, natural selection. I mean, it can't be stopped. It can be slowed down. Yeah, I agree with that. But at the end of the day, it can't be stopped, and there's no evidence that it can be stopped or will be stopped. So there's examples in inbred populations like Homo neanderthal and the hobbits and the mammoths, all high genetic load. And you can see the various pathologies that occur because of it. But at the end of the day, it's just the inbreeding's a sneak preview as to where we're going as a species. So yeah, I know you guys have artificially contrived mechanisms, and most of the time they're not even biologically real. But those that want to hold on to that type of evolution, well, obviously they're going to have to come up with something. But I'm sitting back, relaxing, and just taking in the evidence for what it is.
Well, if you want to go there, I mean, Sanford is a creationist, a young Earth creationist, and he has produced bad models. So I don't understand how he's an authority on that.
Well, it's a trade secret among population geneticists that man is presently degenerating and that they panic about the near neutral mutation problem. But Dr. John Sanford
it's not a problem for evolution.
It is, but we can agree to disagree and go on to another question.
All right.
Oh, right. So, sorry, I got distracted. Trying to keep up with the questions as they've come in, and thanks for your patience. We've only got a few minutes left of Q&A. I'm sorry to do that, but we got to do it. It's just to respect everybody's time. The second thing is reports of people calling people names like retard in the audience. Please don't do that. We usually only usually go after hate speech, but we actually would prefer, it's okay to criticize ideas, go for it, nobody cares, but if you want to try to refrain from criticizing people, and especially name calling, using the R word like that. So, and mean to imply that basically it's just I don't think people should use the R word in that way as an insult. So, John, let's see. I'm going to catch up with you for the alleged profanity. If you guys can do me a favor, we can let profanity fly in the chat, but we'd ask you not to, just to try to keep it so that it's not too distracting from the ideas and arguments and stuff. And so that's both sides. Both sides are guilty of that. So I'm not trying to point anybody out or put them on the spot. Next up, thanks for your patience. Saint Dragon asks, standing for truth, what is your degree?
Oh, that same type of question was asked, I think, 2 debates ago. I don't really think it's even relevant to this. Is that Saint Dragon? Yeah, maybe we can set up a debate with him and I, and we'll see how well he fares in the lion's den with standing for truth. But yeah, that's all I got to say to that. I don't.
Gotcha. Next, we'll try to keep moving through these as fast as possible. Richard Madsen has a question. I've kind of bumped up some of the questions for SnakeWasRight so that we wouldn't have Standing for Truth getting 30 questions in a row. So this way it's a little bit interspersed. That way SnakeWasRight gets a little bit of action too. So Richard Madsen asks, for Snake, you said no vertebrates were in the Cambrian. What about Matter-Picasus? Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing this. It's outside of my field. And he said, and what about Antenborohi? If you know what he's talking about.
Well, I just said mammals. I'm pretty sure there's probably vertebrates in the Cambrian. But there are only mammals in the upper layers, suggesting that they arose at some point after the lower layers.
Gotcha.
That's just irrefutable evidence of evolution.
Gotcha. Thanks very much for that question and for your answer. And, again, if you can do me a favor, please don't delete comments in the chat, even if they have swear words. We're going to let 100 flowers bloom, but I would ask, if you guys could also do me a favor and not swear, and we don't even have to worry about it. So, next, by the way, we totally appreciate these questions. They've been terrific. And what we have to do is, given that we started 2 hours ago, we're a half hour past. I hope you guys can forgive me, but we can't quite go on to the rest of the questions. I'm really sorry about that. But we do have a lot more, and again, forgive me for that. Just to respect everybody's time, we want to say thank you for your questions. For the debaters, do you have any last parting phrases, anything you'd like to say, anything for the audience or for each other?
I would say, Taylor, thanks for coming on and participating in this debate. I think it was a good show. Audience had fun. I had fun. Hope you had fun. And James, once again, and as always, thanks for putting on these debates. I can't recommend your channel enough. I love it. I think it's really profitable. But other than that, yeah, thanks so much, guys.
I would say similarly, thank you for having this on. I love debating. I love the platform, and hopefully we can get some more going in the future.
Thanks. I appreciate that from both of you guys. Thank you for donating your time. Basically just coming on here and getting in the hot seat for everybody else, so we get to hear your ideas. I definitely enjoy it, and so I got to say thank you. And so with that, one last reminder, the speakers links are down in the description. You guys can check those out, those of you in the audience, if you'd like to. And I want to say thanks to the audience for your questions. Thanks for being here. Again, we're shooting for a nonpartisan platform. We want to have it hopefully be a fair shake for everybody. And then also we want to basically welcome everybody. So we appreciate that. And with that, we will say, we hope you have a great night. Keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable.